was yesterday after we ate Thanksgiving dinner, which was almost over 24 hours ago, and there's still ice in it. So check out the link in the description box to get yourself one. I also want to quickly mention that I do have a Patreon, so if you are looking for more true crime content from me, that link is also down in the description box. Okay, so today's story begins in Wenatchee, Washington, with a girl named MacKenzie Cowell, who was born on April 1st, 1992. Nicole loved dancing and music. She was in like a dance company that would go around and compete. Her mother, Sandy Francis, told 48 Hours, quote, "She loved to dance, dance, dance. Anywhere she went, she danced. Grocery stores, gas stations. If a song came on, she would just break out in a boogie," end quote. So, MacKenzie is just described as being full of life and taking life a mile a minute. She also loved root beer floats. That was like her favorite treat. Nicole was always super girly, always kind of primping, and according to an article on CBSNews.com by James Stoltz, this constant primping, always fixing her hair and her makeup, was always kind of who she was. So no one was surprised when she got older and started to think about how she could incorporate this into a career. And she decided to become a hairdresser. So she was actually going to hair school, a hair school called the Academy of Hair Design, when our story really begins in 2010. So MacKenzie's parents were divorced, but she remained close to both of them. Her dad, Reed Cowell, remarried, and he and MacKenzie's stepmother were always very supportive of her, and she was always really close with her mother as well. On February 9th, 2010, 17-year-old MacKenzie leaves the Academy of Hair Design around 3:30, and she tells everyone she'll be back in like 15 minutes. And I guess she was supposed to stay there, like her classes didn't end till 5, so she was leaving early, but she was coming right back. So she asks the school if she needs to sign out or like what, and they told her she could just go. MacKenzie could be seen on the security footage from the school walking out of the building and getting into her car. This would be the last time that anyone would see MacKenzie alive. So she drives off in her car, and then she's just gone. police run the plates, they get his information and they call him. And they tell him that he needs to come and get his car. And Reed is like, okay, but, my daughter's missing. Is she there as well? Did you find her too? And the police inform him that MacKenzie is like nowhere near the car. So he drives out to where the car was left, abandoned, and he's freaking out. This area where our car was found, it's like someone left it there hoping it wouldn't be found. It was hidden. He's so concerned by this, plus his daughter is missing, so with his insistence, police take the car in as evidence. Inside of MacKenzie's car, police found her purse and some clothes that belonged to her. Her cell phone and wallet were not found in the car. The area where the car was found was searched. Police used helicopters and canines to try and help, but they really didn't find anything else in this area. They got search warrants for MacKenzie's phone activity and her social media activity, neither of which had been accessed since she walked out of school. The FBI was brought in to assist in the search. So they pulled the footage from their school, which I talked about earlier, that showed MacKenzie walking out of school, getting into her car, and driving off. And around the time that she left school, she texted her boyfriend, Joaquin, and we'll talk about him in a minute, but this text just said, "Hey, what's up?" And this was the last footage from, or the last activity on her cell phone. On February 13th, 2010, about 30 miles from where MacKenzie's car was abandoned, a body was found along the banks of the Columbia River. And this body would end up belonging to MacKenzie Cowell. When MacKenzie's body was discovered, she was still wearing her school uniform, and her body was on the banks, but her feet were in the water. Her body was taken to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy, which revealed that MacKenzie had suffered from blunt force trauma to the head before her death. She had also sustained several stab wounds, and the cause of her death was determined to be manual strangulation. The medical examiner determined that she had died on February 9th, which was the same day that she had gone missing. He also believed that whoever killed her had tried to dismember her body. There was no sign of sexual assault. And where her body was found was near a vacant home that was for sale. And this home was searched, but no evidence was found. MacKenzie's body was laid to rest on February 25th, and the entire town was in mourning over During her service, Reverend Sandy Brown said, quote, "We are here today because someone stole her life. We are here today also because no one can steal our memories of her." Hundreds of balloons were released while the crowd yelled out, "MacKenzie, we love you." Police launched a homicide investigation right away, and this investigation was headed by the MacKenzie Cowell Task Force, which was this multi-agency group that was put together after MacKenzie's body was discovered. And this task force would end up interviewing over 800 people. And MacKenzie's case was kind of different than a lot of cases I cover because sometimes police don't have a lot to go off of and the investigation is slow. But with MacKenzie's case, police actually had multiple suspects early on in this investigation. As always, police needed to clear those closest to MacKenzie first because statistics say that victims usually know their killers. And so police began with the parents. Police would later say that Sandy and Reed, her parents, were never considered persons of interest, although they did have to rule them out. MacKenzie's father told police that he was home when MacKenzie disappeared, and he had actually been searching for MacKenzie. He was ruled out. But MacKenzie's mother was dating a man named Joey Fisher, and he and MacKenzie, they didn't have the best relationship, which I think is kind of normal. But the reason that he was really on investigators' radar was because, I guess, the night before MacKenzie went missing, Joey and MacKenzie got into this pretty big argument. So police were always suspicious of her stepfather or her mom's boyfriend. However, there was nothing really to tie him to MacKenzie's murder, and he was ruled out. MacKenzie's boyfriend was also an initial person of interest because often when young women go missing, their romantic partners are involved. Joaquin Feliciano was MacKenzie's boyfriend when she was killed. So he was given a polygraph test, and during this test, he was asked if he knew what happened to MacKenzie. And it showed that he was being deceptive in his answer. According to Reese Woodson in the Daily Film, Joaquin and MacKenzie had also gotten into a really big fight shortly before she went missing. But Joaquin had this airtight alibi, and he would be ruled out. But he wasn't ruled out right away. So at first they just kind of kept their sights investigators about MacKenzie's murder, she said, quote, "I saw it with my own eyes." She said that Sam Cuevos and Emmanuel Saros were responsible. Now, both of these men were drug dealers with very colorful criminal pasts. So, she says she saw this video and she claimed that MacKenzie had been killed because these men believed that she was an informant, and so they killed her even though she was not an informant at all. Liz even knew some details about MacKenzie's death that seemed to prove that she had knowledge of the murder. So she said that the two men had choked MacKenzie and they thought that she was dead, but then she came to and they had to do it again. Because MacKenzie had been strangled, and because most people underestimate how long it takes to actually strangle someone to death, police believed this detail like it made sense to them. So, Liz seems to know a lot about this crime, and she knows stuff that wasn't released in the media. She also has this ring that she says is MacKenzie's, and there are several pictures of MacKenzie where you can see that she's wearing this ring. When MacKenzie's body was found, she wasn't wearing this ring, so again, this kind of further solidifies to police that Liz is telling the truth. No one knows for sure if MacKenzie was wearing that ring on the day that she was murdered. Police would later say that they showed the ring to MacKenzie's family members and no one recognized it. So investigators would spend months trying to verify these claims, trying to track down this video of MacKenzie's death, because that would be evidence that could close this case with a nice little bow. Another suspect that comes up early on in the investigation is this guy who goes to school with MacKenzie, and his name is Christopher Scott Wilson, and he really just doesn't fit in. He dyed his hair black and he wore black eyeliner, and he's also 30 years old, so he's a lot older than most other students, and I guess you could say he was just a weird guy. So he was seen on CCTV footage from the Hair Academy leaving just minutes after MacKenzie walked out. So they have some witness accounts of Christopher's character. A friend wrote this letter to police that said he was obsessed with serial killers, obsessed with dead bodies. He loved the show Dexter, and I guess he even had a tattoo of Hannibal Lecter wearing the mask. He also said that one time they were just walking, and out of the blue, Chris started to choke a female friend, and then just stopped, and they wouldn't talk about it or anything, but it wasn't a joke. Another thing that really stuck out to police was Christopher was writing it from jail, where he was doing time for indecent exposure charges. So, police would later question Christopher about MacKenzie, and he would say that he had nothing to do with her. He had nothing to do with her murder. They weren't friends. He never even ever spoke to her. But as police questioned everyone at MacKenzie's school, a lot of people said contradictory things in regards to MacKenzie and Christopher, their relationship. People kind of got the vibe that he had a crush on her, and he had been seen speaking to her several times by different people. Some students even believed that there was something going on between them, it wasn't a one-sided attraction. So I don't know if Christopher was trying to cover and lie for himself so the police didn't suspect he was involved because he was involved, or if he was just scared and didn't want to be tied to her case because he really had nothing to do with her murder. But investigators could prove that they had some kind of relationship, even if it was just them going to school together like classmates. After MacKenzie was murdered, the town just became this massive hub for rumors. There's all this gossip and all these rumors swirling around. And because Christopher was different, he dressed differently, he wore makeup, he was kind of an easy target, and people just assumed he was guilty. Now, I'm going to talk about some of these rumors that went around about him, but none of them have ever been substantiated. I'm just kind of setting the tone for the trial. So one of the rumors said that Christopher loved to cut people up, and this was why he had been fired from the mortuary. Anyways, months go by, and police have nothing to tie anyone to the crime. They're trying to track down the two men who have a video, but they can't track down the video. And then their, a secondhand witness, I guess, Liz, changes her story and says that she made everything up. Now, she would later change her story again and tell the media that she felt like police were looking into her as a suspect, and she felt like they were closing in on her, and it scared her, so she lied and said she made the whole thing up. But it was true. Police never named Liz as a person of interest. She was the one who had inserted herself into the investigation. They had not come to her looking for information, and it's likely that had she not approached law enforcement, her name would have never been tied to this case at all. So basically, with Liz saying she had the ring, she was also putting herself at the scene of the crime, because first she said she just saw video, but if she just saw video after the fact, how would she have gotten MacKenzie's ring? Police could never prove that this ring belonged to MacKenzie, and so when Liz keeps changing her story, they just kind of pivot the investigation and start looking into other suspects, because Liz's story is falling apart, and she's this type of DNA testing, and I'm not sure why they did this kind of DNA testing, but I know that it is often done when there's only like a tiny sample, but it's not the most definite way to DNA test. So while they have a match, it is not considered to be totally conclusive. A search warrant was then executed on Christopher's apartment, where police sprayed it with luminol and found the presence of blood on like a pretty big area of carpet. So they cut out this area and they took it back to the lab for testing. This bloody patch, they were able to pull DNA from, and the DNA was tested, and it came back as an exclusive match to MacKenzie's DNA. It was determined that Christopher had killed her in his apartment. 8 months after MacKenzie was killed, Christopher first appeared in court, where he was charged with murder. Every time he went to court, he refused to make eye contact with anyone in court. During Christopher's court case, and this is pre-trial stuff, a video was shown to the judge in which Christopher is showing his apartment, and his friend Tessa Schuleman was also there. And in the video, Christopher says, quote, "Does it look clean?" And Tessa responds, quote, "Clean for what happened? Clean considering? Yeah, it's clean considering," end quote. Tessa then zooms the camera into the exact area where MacKenzie's body, or MacKenzie's blood, was found by police. Now, Christopher's defense would claim that the blood had been planted and that he was innocent, and the police were setting him up because basically they just needed to wrap this case up. The defense also brought up this informant and her testimony, trying to establish some reasonable doubt that he was responsible. But all of this was, like I said, pre-trial stuff, because his actual murder trial hadn't started. And then there was kind of a surprising twist. The prosecution just offers Christopher a plea deal. If he pleads guilty to manslaughter, he will only get 6.5 years in prison. But Christopher didn't take this deal. He said it wouldn't matter if they had offered him 6 months, 6 years, or 6 days. He was not going to plead guilty to something he didn't do. But this attitude wouldn't last long, and his lawyers would end up coming back to the state's attorney and asking for a plea deal, or I guess asking if it was still on the table, and they said no. So what changed here was this was after jury selection, and his attorneys found out that if this went to trial, Christopher would probably be found guilty. So the jury's questionnaires had shown that 85% of people believed he was guilty, right off the bat. So in a last-ditch effort to save Christopher, they went back and asked for another plea deal. And I guess the state went to the family when he was asking for the plea deal, and they told them that the plea deal would include a handwritten confession from him. And they were like, "What do you guys think?" And I guess the family agreed to it because he was offered a plea of 14 years in prison. guys a little part of the transcript from his trial. Judge John Bridges said, "Mr. Wilson, it reads, quote, 'This is my statement.'" And then we're going to skip a part. "I also did recklessly cause the death of MacKenzie Cowell by strangulation and by stabbing her with a knife. Mr. Wilson, is that your statement?" And Chris Wilson says, "Yes." And then Judge John Bridges says, "And are those the things you did?" And Chris Wilson says, "Yes." So, later, Chris Wilson would tell 48 Hours that he paused in that moment in the courtroom when the judge asked, "And are those the things you did?" Because this plea deal was based on a lie. And he took it only to avoid getting a longer sentence, but he did pause in between there. So in this interview with 48 Hours, Peter Van Sant says, "Did you almost say no?" And Christopher Wilson says, "Absolutely." And then Peter says, "Do you believe you were framed?" And he said, "Framed by law enforcement, yes." And there kind of maybe is something to these claims. Okay, so this video of him talking to Tessa, and they're like walking around the apartment, talking about it being clean. Well, soon after Mackenzie's body was discovered, he moved out of an apartment which was already planned before she died. And this was the apartment where the blood was found that he was moving out of. So he made this video as like a walkthrough, trying to ensure that he would get his deposit back. And I guess Tessa was just referring to all the partying that went down in the house when she said, like, "Does it look clean after what happened here?" Yes. So the spot where they zoomed in on the recording, according to Tessa, was this stain that they could not get out of the carpet. And because the apartment was vacant when police searched it, there are people who believe that they planted blood evidence where there was already a stain. Plus, okay, if you look at that first plea deal where Christopher was given 6 years for murder, that kind of shows that the prosecution didn't feel like they had a very good case. But if they had DNA on the duct tape found on Mackenzie's body that was a match to Christopher, and Mackenzie's blood found on the carpet in the apartment he lived in at the time she was murdered, that would be pretty solid evidence for a case. So why did they offer this plea deal? Was it because Chris was being set up? Well, according to the prosecution, they offered the plea deal because they had no evidence, nothing that could prove that Christopher had been inside the apartment when Mackenzie's blood was deposited onto the carpet. So Chris had gotten this plea deal, but then less than a year later he filed a motion to withdraw his guilty plea. He contends that his plea was not voluntary and claims that he entered into a plea bargain because he didn't fully understand the consequences of how much time he would ultimately serve in prison. An appeals judge would end up denying Wilson's motion to withdraw his guilty plea. He said that Wilson provided no evidence that he misunderstood the plea deal that release date will be in August of 2023, and he will be 42 years old. Now, I want to know what you guys think. Do you think he's guilty of murder, or do you think there was some sort of setup? I typically never believe when people claim that evidence was planted by investigators, but in this case, 6 years for murder does raise some red flags for me. If Christopher's DNA was found on the duct tape that covered Mackenzie's mouth, in my mind that puts him at the scene of the murder. Then finding blood in his apartment that matched Mackenzie's would also point to his guilt. Plus, we already know that the defense team was worried about all the jurors believing he was guilty before the trial ever started. So it looked like the prosecution had a slam dunk case. So why offer him 6 years? Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments. I just quickly want to cite my sources. I got information from Hometown Homicide Season 1, Episode 4. The Daily Film had an article by Ari Woodson titled "The Murder of MacKenzie Cowell. Has this dark murder finally been solved?" A CBS News article by James Schultz titled "Secrets of the River." Thanks again so much for joining me. Please check out my Patreon in the link in the description box. I would be so grateful if you joined us over there.